to introduce myself a little more properly, so I'm Joe Brewer, and I have a website that I call an organization, the Center for Applied Cultural Evolution, but really it's a website with an email list. So it looks more official than it is. It has occasionally had fiscal sponsorship and all, but mostly I'm unaffiliated to organizations and preferring to be that way. And what I came to talk to you all about tonight is bioregional regeneration. And I want to put those two big words into a context that we can start to understand what the heck they mean. Because bioregional is one thing and regeneration is another thing, and they only really make sense to think about in the context of what's happening in the world right now, which is why we need to be thinking in this way. And this is one of those stories that is really difficult intellectually, that to really understand what's going on in the world, you have to study a lot of different things and translate between different fields of knowledge. But it's also, probably even more so, really difficult emotionally, in that as we try to understand what's happening in the world, it's inherently traumatizing. It's inherently painful. Because what is happening in the world is a huge amount of loss, wasted, pathetic, stupid loss around a particular kind of greed that is not the greed of individual human beings. It's really easy to point a finger and say that billionaire, that politician, whatever, to humanize it in that way, but that actually fails to see that it's the humanizing of the biosphere that's the problem, but in a very specific way. Which is there's a thing about what it means to be human that has brought us to the brink of our own extinction. Brought us to a place where we are destabilizing the entire planet in a way that if it enters a proper mass extinction event, it'll take us down with it. And so we're at this place where we have, in a sense, gained superhero powers at the level of like a tantruming 2-year-old, without any sense of the power of what cultural evolution can do. And as we're realizing it, as we just gained the eyes to see it in the last 30 or 40 years, what we're seeing is the darkest side of humanity. And the darkest side of humanity is not genocide. It's not rape. It's not some of the things that we've thought of that were like really big and bad. It's actually the death of the complexity for the entire biosphere of the Earth, which is what a mass extinction event can create. And so I want to start here and then get to bioregional regeneration. So what is it about being human that made it possible for us to do this? It's interesting because there's only one other time in the history of the Earth that an organism, a part of the biology of the planet, was able to destabilize the whole thing. And the previous version was when algae, or cyanobacteria, appeared on the scene about 700 million years ago. And they're the ones who excreted all the oxygen that filled up the atmosphere with oxygen, making the environment toxic to themselves, and triggered a mass extinction event that killed off about 99% of the species that existed at the time, which was the biggest mass extinction event prior to the present. And it was caused by an organism changing its environment in a way that had cascading consequences for everything in that environment, which is interestingly similar to what humans are doing, except humans are doing it in a very different way. We're not doing it by the chemistry of our digestion. We're doing it by our capacity to build on culture that came before. And so I want to take a moment and really give you a sense of where all of this comes from, so that we can come forward in time and see where we are now. And the human story is, in some ways, the story of the entire 3.8 billion years of life on Earth. And you could tell it in this broad, sweeping way to say all of the earlier organisms that gave rise to functions and capabilities to make hominids possible. But our story of destabilizing the Earth really only goes back about 3 million years. and say it only goes back about 3 million years, because most people today who think we're talking about the ecological crisis, if they're even moderately informed, think that it has to do with burning of greenhouse gases and changing of the climate, and that it started somewhere in the 1800s when we discovered fossil fuels, and or maybe in the 1700s with coal, and the 1800s with oil. But really the story goes back about 3 million years. And it's very important to understand this, because then we can see what caused all of this to happen. The thing that happened 3 million years ago was our ancestors came up with this phenomenal ability to have conceptual metaphor. They could look at a rock and see in the rock a shape of something that looked vaguely like a wedge, like a cutting utensil, like a claw or a fingernail, or like a tooth. And they could take another rock and they could chip away at it to make that object look like what was in their mind that they were projecting into it with their ability to have metaphor. And they created the first stone tools. These are the people we call Homo habilis, and those tools are called the Olduvai tools. And for about 1 million years, there was very little technological innovation, and they pretty much stayed the same for that period of time. Now, why is this the beginning of our story? It's because when they gained this ability to project a conceptual understanding onto the world, and then take actions to change the world to match what they saw in their minds, they did something thermodynamic that was very interesting. They took energy and nutrients from the environment that they could not digest into their bodies and made it easier to digest them by taking a function of their bodies and removing it to the outside of their bodies, which is the ability to masticate, which is to chew, cut, sever, to break apart your food, which is what your teeth do. And when they gained the ability to take a carcass, because mostly they were scavenging animals at the time, it's early hominids, they find a carcass of something like an antelope or a deer or some similar animal, and they could use these cutting tools to cut away the skin of the animal, get to the flesh and cut into the flesh and make it smaller, so they were able to digest and absorb more nutrients and more energy from the environment around them. This began a process of changing the environment with the tools that they could use to interact with it, to turn more of the bounty of nature into human bodies. Taking more of that material that eventually bacteria or fly larvae or other things were going to eat, and instead humans would eat it. So there'd be more humans. In the beginning, this was a slow process. Flash forward about 1 million years, 1.5 million years, 2.3, 2.4 million years ago, and our ancestors did something else really phenomenal. They learned how to control fire. And when they controlled fire and began to set small brush fires and then collect the carcasses of animals that had been caught in them, they could chew them and they could digest them more easily. And they'd have less problems with bacteria and parasites because it neutralized it. What's amazing about cooking is that cooking is an externalized form of something the body does. It's pre-digesting the food. It's making it easier to break down. It's beginning that digestion process. This is a huge turning point in the history of our species, because the two biggest energy hogs in the human body, or really in any body similar to ours for other animals, are the gut and the brain. So if you take away the need to have long intestines to slowly digest food without getting bacterial infections, then you can gradually release the pressure for evolution to work on the gut. And the gut can get smaller and smaller as you eat more and more cooked food, which frees up energy to go into larger and larger brains. So this is two things that our ancestors did. One is they were able, again, to take more nutrients more efficiently from their environment and put it into human bodies, but they also created a parallel track of evolution. Normal biological evolution, and now they had cultural evolution working together. That as their cultural capacities for cooking and for hunting and for getting food and for changing their environments to acquire food, that was cultural evolution. They had to learn it. They had to develop tools to do it. As they built this pathway of cultural evolution, teaching it to their offspring from generation to the next, biological evolution and cultural evolution became like two parts of the same thing that's moving forward in time, feeding off of each other, which gradually started to accelerate as they got better and better at doing this. How does this lead to what's happening now? There's another piece of evolution. Evolution is only understandable if you look at the level of entire populations. And you look at, like, for all of the beavers in this forest, there's a whole population of them. What are their different behavioral traits and their physical characteristics, and which ones are better suited to their environment? And the environment changes, and you ask that question again and again. And that's what evolution is doing all the time. Well, with our ancestors, we formed an amazing adaptation, which is still our singular adaptation, our most powerful tool, which is we engage in teamwork like no other animal on the planet. We cooperate with each other in ways that are truly unprecedented in the history of life on this planet, because we have semantic language. We have the ability with that earlier capacity for metaphor, which gradually turned into gestural, musical, and spoken language. That then you could do something like take that rock, have someone sitting next to you and say, no, look here, chip it this way. And with those verbal cues, you could teach much, much more efficiently. Which means the ability for cultures to get more complex would go up. You could make more complex cultures because you could teach them with fidelity. This ability to teach becomes essential for culture to build on itself. If I create a really complex tool, like a bow and arrow, or a kayak, or a canoe, it's really hard to learn how to make one of those. Just by trial and error, you would probably fail to make a functioning model in one lifetime. But if you have ancestors for generations practicing, refining, and improving their skills, teaching them with high fidelity, then you can have really sophisticated technology. And by the way, the bows and arrows of hunter-gatherers from 30,000 years ago were really sophisticated. So today, when they have students and test subjects and experiments, they try to make some of these old tools, old Awan stone tools from 3 million years ago, the bows and arrows from 40,000 years ago. People can't do it without extensive instruction and years of practice and training, just like you'd have to apprentice in any skill you have today. So as humans engaged in teamwork to build these increasingly complex tools, cultures, languages, they also began to branch out into different teams. So you have different cultures. And then what starts to happen is you have evolutionary selection at the group level. Not just at the family level, but at the level of entire tribes or entire cultures. So that when the Neolithic Revolution happened, about 10,000, 11,000 years ago, that's the invention of agriculture, the people who invented agriculture could create really complex hierarchical societies. In the early days were called city-states. Some of them went on to become civilizations. When they did this, they could engage in competition with other cultural groups. And we all pretty much know the history as that game refined itself, that now we live in the first planetary scale, empire-like civilization. Because they have absorbed, consumed, or destroyed every other culture on their path to build this globalized civilization. Here's the problem. Does anyone know of a civilization in history that didn't collapse? Can you name one? Did the Mayans avoid collapse? The Incas, the Sumerians, the Abyssinians, the Roman Empire? No, they all collapsed. There's something inherently destabilizing about civilizations as a model of cultural evolution. And what it has to do with is a combination of the structural inequality within the society, which eventually leads to internal disruption and breakdown through various different pathways, or it can break down by degradation of the land that it depends upon for its survival. And you look at different civilizations in history, and some combination of factors of internal instability combined with degraded land have toppled them all. So we have no reason to think that this civilization will be any different, except that it's planetary in scale, which has never happened before. So now there's no ability to have the soils depleted in Mesopotamia, Iraq, Syria, these places that are now deserts, that used to be called the Fertile Crescent. They destroyed their soil thousands of years ago. But those civilization models moved into Europe. They moved in China. They moved to other places. Eventually, the Europeans had too much population density integrated land, so they shipped people to the Americas after the Americas were hollowed out by parasites and disease and genocide. And so this process of growth of this model of civilization has finally achieved its end game. It's grown to the level of destabilizing the entire planet. And it must collapse because it's overshot its capacities and it's degraded all of its lands. The question is if it'll take all humans down with it, and how many other species. This amazing graph that I usually use when I'm giving talks with slides that shows the growth of human population like this. It's exponential. It starts off pretty slow, and then it goes faster and faster, and it shoots up. If you put on that same graph, say between the year 1800 and 2000, that graph looks like this. Right next to it is the rate of non-human extinction, going exponential and tracking it almost perfectly. That is, in the field of thermodynamics, that is called entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, which says anytime there's energy exchanged in some process, you never reduce the amount of entropy. It either stays the same or it goes up. Entropy is the measure of disorder in the system. So as the human system became more and more complex, we got this amazing, complex, globalized civilization. We got that at the cost of the loss of complexity of all other ecosystems on the planet. Eventually, there will be a point where the biosphere unravels. That's called the mass extinction event. And so, this is our context that we are in the middle of. Like I said, this is an intellectually difficult topic to discuss. It's also an emotionally difficult topic to discuss. Interestingly, it's often also a spiritually difficult topic to discuss. What is real, what is meaningful, what is sacred when we're talking about something like this. Usually that's the most important conversation to have, actually. That's how we find our way. So now with that context in mind, we can talk about bioregional regeneration. Because this is the context in which it needs to be done. So I'll start by giving a couple of definitions, so we at least know what we're talking about. And then we can unravel a little bit or dig deeper into what they mean. So this word bioregion. A bioregion is defined in two ways that are put together. The first way applies to all non-human species, and the second way applies to humans. And I've seen the word bioregion used for non-human species. So a bioregion is defined in a functional way based on the climatic, geological, and ecological shared space of functional relationships. So what that means is if you look at something like a watershed or a mountain range or a coastal estuary, and within some kind of latitude range, some kind of climatic zone, you'll have types of flora and fauna that live there. So the biological region, bioregion, is defined using those physical and biological features. You can say anything that's able to live in this environment is sharing a bioregion. So you can have a marine bioregion for something like, what would be the marine bioregion of a coral reef, which is a non-human bioregion? What is the bioregion of a tropical rainforest? Where you can see there's a complexity of interdependent relationships appropriate to that place. Now for humans, bioregion adds another layer, which is the shared cultural identity of knowing how to live in place within that bioregion. So if you have the people of what we currently call the Pacific Northwest, or if you have the people of Mesoamerica, or if you have the people of the Hudson Valley, it can be larger or smaller scales, which makes it a confusing term to use. People use it at different scales. Then you have systems of life, life systems, ways of living that tell you this is a place where you can live in this way. And so if you look at the people of this region, where we are now, they were one of the very few places that had a largely hunter-gatherer lifestyle but had permanent settlements. And that was because of the sheer abundance of marine wildlife here and the ability to survive on fishing and clams and other things like this, in addition to all the textiles and wood and stone and anything they needed from the land. But they had life systems. They also had worldviews, and they had spiritual systems. And they also had social regulation systems, meaning that they had social norms that were enforced to tell them what you do or don't do to that water supply, what you do or don't do to that fish, what you do or don't do to that tree. And so they had an integrated life system. So a bioregion is an integrated life system appropriate to the land that it's on. Regeneration is what the science of living systems has discovered as the way of defining what life is. So there were two Chilean neuroscientists and philosophers. One of them was also a Buddhist monk, Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, who in the early 1970s were asking deep questions about a system's view of life. When Fritjof Capra was writing a book by that name at the same time, they were among a kind of a shared space of conversation. And Maturana and Varela asked the question, how do you define life from a systems point of view? What they found was that the definition of life was a dynamic process of interrelationships that had a very specific pattern to it. And that pattern is that it, moment to moment, reproduces the conditions of being alive. And they gave it a beautiful word, autopoiesis. Poiesis is the Latin word, autopoiesis. And poiesis is the word that poetry comes from. Poiesis means the ability to express oneself. Autopoiesis is the self-created ability to express oneself. So to be alive is to be able to express oneself while at the same time reproducing the conditions, a moment later, to express oneself. It's a dynamic pattern of continual cycles that keep going as long as life is happening. Regeneration is autopoiesis. Regeneration is what any living thing does to continue generating its ability to continue being alive. So this is something that is super important for us to think about, bioregional regeneration. Because now we're talking about life systems within a landscape context, reproducing the conditions to live.
Yeah.
What's interesting is this big conversation about sustainability kind of missed the point, because sustainability is a byproduct of regeneration. So if you look at the human body, like my body, which has an estimated 37 trillion cells in it, and it's doing something pretty phenomenal. It's maintaining homeostasis. It's keeping vital parameters for survival within a very narrow range. My internal body temperature, my pH level, my body density and pressure, these are things that are kept in a very narrow range. Very low tolerance going outside of them. And if you take body temperature, you can get a heat stroke or you can get hypothermia by just going a very